3 minutes ago, a sentence attributed to Prince Harry detonated across the internet, and within seconds, people were saying the same word in disbelief. Gone. Not injured. Not ill. Not stepped back from view. Gone. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that single word, ripped from context and hurled into headlines, has done what royal silence always does best. It has allowed imagination to sprint ahead of reality. Parents froze. Comment sections erupted. Screenshots multiplied faster than clarification ever could. And somewhere in the noise, a child's name became a trending topic before anyone stopped to ask the most basic question. What was actually said? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When stories move this fast, facts don't just lag behind, they get reshaped, bent, sometimes replaced entirely. And this story matters right now not because of what people think they heard, but because of how quickly certainty formed without confirmation. Prince Harry has spoken rarely and carefully about his children. When he does, every word is measured, sometimes painfully so. That's why the reaction to this moment feels so jarring. A man known for restraint suddenly being credited with a declaration so final, so devastating, that it implies an irreversible loss. But listen closely. Something doesn't sit right. If this were truly what people are assuming, the response wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't be chaotic speculation and recycled clips. It would be something else entirely. Structured, immediate, official. And that absence, that gap between expectation and reality, is where this story actually begins. This isn't about debunking emotion. The fear people felt was real. The shock was real. Parents imagining the unthinkable didn't invent that feeling. But emotions don't equal evidence, and headlines don't equal confirmation, especially when they're built on fragments. Ask yourself this. Have you actually heard Prince Harry say those words in full? Or have you seen them repeated, reframed, tightened into something sharper and more clickable? Because there is a version of this story that's being shared widely, and then there's the version that exists in context. Those two versions are not the same. And here's where the tension deepens. The phrase that sparked all of this didn't come from nowhere. It didn't emerge out of pure fabrication. It came from a real moment, attached to a real statement, delivered in a setting where every syllable mattered. That's what makes this so dangerous and so compelling. Something was acknowledged. Something was confirmed. But what that something actually was remains frustratingly unclear. And that uncertainty is doing the damage. Royal history is full of moments like this. Moments where silence is interpreted as concealment, where absence is read as tragedy, where privacy is mistaken for disappearance. And when children are involved, restraint itself becomes suspect. So before we go any further, pause for a second. Not to dismiss concern, but to interrogate it. To slow down the instinct to conclude. To separate the word that went viral from the meaning it may not carry. Because the most unsettling possibility here isn't that something happened to Archie Harrison. It's that millions of people are reacting to a version of events that may never have been said at all. And when we look closely at where this headline came from, and how quickly it hardened into fact, the story takes a very different shape. But that shape only becomes visible when we trace it back to the exact moment this all started. And once we do, what emerges is not clarity, but something far more troubling. Did Prince Harry actually say this? Or did the internet quietly finish the sentence for him? That question sounds simple. It isn't. Because when you trace this story backward, you don't arrive at a dramatic announcement or a breaking press conference. You arrive at something far more fragile. A fragment. A moment. A line that was never meant to stand on its own. This is where the headline was born. Not in a palace statement. Not in a medical update. But in a short passage pulled from a broader conversation, clipped down, stripped of surrounding language, and released into a digital ecosystem that rewards urgency over accuracy. Once that happened, the transformation was almost automatic. The phrase "he's gone" became a conclusion instead of a clue. And from there, everything accelerated. Social media did what it always does in moments like this. Screenshots replaced source material. Reposts replaced verification. The original context became harder to find than the rumor built on top of it. Within minutes, people weren't asking what Prince Harry meant. They were reacting to what they believed he confirmed. But pause here, because if you slow this down, just slightly, a contradiction appears. Prince Harry is not careless with language. He never has been. In interviews, in speeches, even in moments of visible emotion, he chooses words deliberately, sometimes frustratingly so. Which makes this idea that he would announce something this severe in passing, without structure or clarification, deeply inconsistent with everything we know about how he communicates. So where did the certainty come from? It came from compression, from the way modern headlines work. Take a longer statement, carve out the most emotionally charged phrase, then present it as a standalone declaration. Suddenly nuance disappears. Suddenly implication hardens into fact. Ask yourself this. Have you actually seen the full exchange this line came from? Or have you only seen the same sentence repeated by dozens of accounts, each adding a little more certainty than the last? Because here's what's rarely mentioned. The initial source didn't frame it as a death announcement. That interpretation emerged later, layered on by reaction, not confirmation. And once that version took hold, it became self-reinforcing. Every repost treated it as settled truth. This is how rumors become headlines without ever passing through evidence. And there's another detail that complicates things further. Timing. If something truly catastrophic had occurred, there would be a sequence, an immediate response, coordinated statements, a visible shift in public posture. None of that happened. Instead, there was silence. And in royal narratives, silence is often read as guilt or concealment. But sometimes, it's simply restraint. Still, restraint doesn't calm the internet. It agitates it. So the phrase continued to circulate, detached from its origin, growing heavier with each retelling. People filled in the blanks themselves. And once a conclusion feels emotionally right, it rarely gets questioned. But here's the unsettling part. The line attributed to Prince Harry does exist. It wasn't fabricated out of thin air, which means something was being acknowledged. Something was being marked as an ending. The problem is, we may have been looking at the wrong kind of ending entirely. Because when you examine what Harry was actually addressing, and what he conspicuously avoided naming, the meaning of that phrase begins to shift. And that shift changes everything. Yes, there was confirmation. But no, it wasn't the confirmation people think. That's the pivot point. And it's where this story becomes uncomfortable. Because when you step back from the headlines and look at what Prince Harry was actually addressing, a different picture begins to form. One that doesn't fit neatly into the word gone, at least not in the way it's been interpreted. What he spoke about wasn't a sudden event. It wasn't framed as an emergency. It was measured, reflective, almost guarded. And that alone should make you pause. Harry wasn't reacting to something that had just happened. He was speaking about something that had already changed, something that had been processed, or at least contained. And the distinction matters, because people don't speak that way in the immediate aftermath of tragedy. They just don't. Listen to the tone. Not panicked, not broken, careful, deliberate, almost as if he was navigating language he knew would be dissected later. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this were what the internet believes it to be, would he sound like this? Or would there be cracks? Instead, what we hear is restraint layered on top of something unresolved. A kind of emotional distance that suggests not loss in the physical sense, but separation in another form. A boundary drawn. A door closed. Something no longer accessible in the way it once was. And that's where the word gone becomes slippery. Because gone doesn't always mean death. Sometimes it means absence. Sometimes it means removal. Sometimes it means something that still exists, but not for you. Not anymore. Harry has spoken before about loss in ways that are explicit. He names it. He confronts it directly. This wasn't that. This was vaguer. Almost intentionally so. As if naming the thing outright would create consequences he wasn't prepared to trigger. And that avoidance is telling. Ask yourself this. Why speak at all, if the message was meant to remain private? Why acknowledge something had ended, while refusing to define what that ending actually was? That tension, between saying just enough and not a word more, is where interpretation rushed in to fill the gap. And people filled it with the worst possibility first. But look at what wasn't said. No dates. No details. No confirmation language. No appeals for privacy that usually accompany personal tragedy. No acknowledgement of public concern. That absence is as loud as the phrase that went viral. It suggests the subject wasn't meant to be understood literally. Or at least, not by us. And then there's the timing. Why now? Why reference this change at this moment, instead of when it actually occurred? That delay implies process, not shock. Adjustment, not catastrophe. Which leads to an even more unsettling thought. What if the confirmation wasn't about something happening to Archie, but about Archie being removed from something? From view. From narrative. From a role people assumed he occupied. Because if that's the case, then gone doesn't describe a tragedy. It describes a decision. And decisions, especially royal ones, are rarely explained in real time. They're revealed later. Sometimes much later. And often, only indirectly. And if that's what this was, then the question shifts entirely. Not what happened to Archie, but what was Archie taken out of? And once you ask that, the story no longer feels like breaking news. It feels like something has been quietly unfolding for a while, and we're only just noticing the outline of it now. What if gone doesn't mean dead, but erased? That possibility is uncomfortable, maybe even unsettling. But once you consider it, it's hard to ignore how neatly it fits the pieces that don't line up. Because royal history is filled with disappearances that weren't tragedies in the physical sense. They were institutional, symbolic. Decisions made quietly, then protected by silence, so complete it invites speculation decades later. Names removed from official narratives. Roles quietly reassigned. Futures redirected without announcement. And when that happens, the language used is often deliberately vague. Think about how power speaks when it doesn't want to be quoted. It leans on implication, on phrasing that can't be pinned down, on words that mean one thing emotionally and another structurally. Gone is perfect for that. It satisfies the speaker's truth without explaining it. It closes a chapter without saying where the book went. And that's what makes this moment feel different. Because Harry wasn't announcing an ending. He was acknowledging one. That distinction matters. If something had been lost suddenly, there would be grief in the immediacy. If something had been taken, there would be anger. But what we hear instead is something closer to resignation. Acceptance. A tone that suggests the decision. Whatever it was, is no longer up for discussion. Which brings us back to Archie's visibility. Ask yourself this. When was the last time we saw him in a way that felt unambiguous? Not a carefully framed image. Not a reference in passing. But a moment that placed him clearly, undeniably, in the public story people assume he's still part of. That question alone makes people uneasy, because most don't realize how long it's been, or how much assumption has filled the gap left by absence. And absence, when prolonged, starts to feel intentional. What if gone means withdrawn? From public life, from royal positioning, from expectations placed on a child before he could consent to them? What if it's not about loss, but about refusal? Refusal to participate, refusal to explain, refusal to perform normalcy for an audience that demands access. If that's the case, then the tragedy isn't what people fear. It's something quieter. It's the realization that a child's existence has been turned into a narrative battleground, that every appearance, or lack of one, is interpreted as evidence. That privacy, once claimed, becomes suspicious simply because it's enforced. And maybe that's why Harry's language feels so careful. Because once you remove a child from a story the public believes it owns, there's no way to do it cleanly. Someone will always feel deprived. Someone will always assume the worst. So instead, you let a word slip. One that's true in a narrow sense. One that closes the door without slamming it. But here's the part that lingers. If gone means erased from public expectation, then this wasn't a moment. It was a line in a longer process. A quiet confirmation that something people believed was still ongoing isn't. And if that's true, then the real question isn't about Archie at all. It's about us. About why the absence of access feels like loss. About why silence terrifies more than truth. And about what it says that a single word could send millions into panic, without anyone stopping to ask what kind of disappearance they were actually reacting to. Because once you see it that way, the story doesn't resolve. It deepens. And the unease doesn't come from what happened. It comes from what we were never meant to witness in the first place. And this is where everything circles back to that first reaction. The shock. The panic. The certainty that formed before understanding had a chance to catch up. Because when you strip this story down to what we actually know, not what trended, not what was inferred, something uncomfortable emerges. There was no announcement of death. No confirmation of catastrophe. What there was, instead, was acknowledgement. Careful, limited, and deliberately incomplete. That distinction changes the meaning of the headline entirely. The opening question wasn't wrong. It was just misdirected. The danger wasn't in asking what happened to Archie Harrison. The danger was assuming that gone could only mean one thing. That loss must always be physical. That absence must always signal tragedy. But what if the real issue here is our relationship to access? We've grown used to knowing, or at least believing we know. Royal births, royal appearances, royal milestones, all documented, archived, consumed. When that pattern breaks, it feels like something has been